Okay, welcome back, all. This is going to be the first supplemental for Unit 1, and I'm going to do Israel first, and then we'll move to Iran second, and you can follow along in the slides. All right, so a less than brief history of Israel, number 1. This kind of stuff is really difficult to start. Like, where do we start history? So I'm just choosing the World War I era. Some of the Zionist movement started before that, around the 1890s, as we've talked about. But this is where the sort of immigration patterns really start to get rolling. All right. So in World War One, you've got the Allies versus the Central Powers. The Allies bloc includes France, Russia, and the UK. Toward the very, very end in 1917, the US joins. You've got the Central Powers, Germany, the old Austria-Hungary Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, which is sort of collapsing under its own weight during this period. And I would point out a powerful political science theory called balance of power theory here. So you saw this here, you saw it during World War One and World War II, and arguably we're seeing it again today. We may be moving into another balance of power, precarious position. And this comes from some very famous international relations scholars named Waltz and Mearsheimer. And they're basically discussing how the balance of power in the world works. And their theory is that as the balance of power becomes close, right, you get a rising power or a falling power or whatever. When it becomes close between the two blocks or between two world powers, like today, US and China, those are the likeliest periods that you'll see mass global war, right? So this is something a little bit concerning to political scientists and international relations experts, in that arguably we are entering into a new balance of power era. All right, second slide. The Sykes-Picot Agreement. This was an agreement, we talked about this before, in 1916 between the Brits, France, Russia, and Italy on how to break down the Middle Eastern territory into boundaries once the Ottoman Empire was completely destroyed, right? And everybody saw it on the horizon. The Ottoman Empire is collapsing, but they wanted to try to figure out what to do with it afterward. First, to benefit themselves, second, for strategic positions, and third, to ensure that there wasn't chaos and civil war across the entire region after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And so Palestine was declared to be a shared territory or protectorate under British, French, and Russian protection. It didn't really pan out that way in the long run. The French never really got too involved. They were bogged down in northern Africa, the Maghreb. The Russians, again, had the Russian Revolution of 1917, where Trotsky and Lenin take the state under the Communist Revolution. And so they get left out as well. And so basically, it's just the Brits providing security, advice, these sorts of things. The UK had already sort of promised an Arab homeland in the McMahon-Hussein documents that we've talked about with Ali Hussein from Mecca. They sort of backed off of these agreements, which caused some frustration. Okay, we'll move on to the third slide, the Balfour Declaration. So we had just signed, basically there had been the McMahon-Hussein documents, and then in 1916 we get the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and then in 1917 we get the Balfour Declaration. This is a letter between the British Foreign Secretary at the time, Arthur Balfour, and Lord Rothschild, who was a Zionist advocate at the time. They agreed to, quote, a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. They never really called it a state. There's a lot of ambiguity around the words that were being used, right? There were worries at the time that this was going to cause anti-Semitism across the world, and especially with Arab populations. Um, and the UK government in 2017 actually came out and said, like, we kind of screwed this up. We should have thought very much more about the Arab and Palestinian populations at the time. Um, but this Balfour Declaration basically leads to an even bigger explosion in sort of Zionist thought, the Zionist movement, and leads to greater immigration post World War One to Jerusalem. And around, I guess around at this time, 1917, 1918, the best estimates I can get, we have about 20 to 25,000 Jewish people living in Palestine proper at this time. All right, next slide. The mandatory Palestine. So the Brits take over Palestine in 1920. This was later formalized in the UN, or the League of Nations at that time, excuse me. The League of Nations, created by Woodrow Wilson, the US president. The US never actually signed on to it. It collapsed, at the beginning of World War II and later became sort of the UN. But the League of Nations formalizes the Palestinian Mandate in 1922. The British, because they were a colonial system, had a scoring system, like a scorecard for how likely each of their territories was to be able to govern themselves, right? And the Brits deemed that this was a Class A territory; they could easily govern themselves. But they also, in sort of the public documents, said that they are unfit for self-governance despite their internal documentation. And so at this point, the Arabs reject any participation with Jewish representatives in discussing the Palestinian mandate, what the state will look like, what the government will look like, all of these sorts of things. And here I would offer a warning for those of you who will work in institutions later or try to get into institutions. It is excellent to make a stand, a moral or ethical stand, when you are outside of a power institution, right? So think civil rights, these sorts of things. But once you're inside of an institution and you have some power, simply walking away or walking away from the opportunity to be within that institution often backfires, right? And so we see this in a lot of Latin American legislatures. We've seen it in a lot of Middle Eastern legislatures. We are arguably seeing it with the US walking away from all of these rules building institutions at the international level. Eventually, we are going to have to play by those rules that are set, right? The power exists. Our exit will lead to a filling of the vacuum. And these really technical, detailed policies on like internet and how you store data and how you transmit information and electrical lines and fiber optics rules and all of these things that people don't ever think about. Like, we are going to have to follow those rules. Exiting is not going to help anything, right? And so I would warn you, use the power within the system. Do not leave a power vacuum to be filled by your opponents. Um, Even if things aren't going all that well, right? It is better to fight from within than to exit and try to fight from without. Okay, enough on that. Um, we also start to see at this point really widespread riots and attacks between both sides, between the Arabs and the Jews, all the way up until 1948, right? Which the Arabs refer to as the Nakba. All right, next slide. Oh, I just wanted to point out, you can sort of see where the Jewish population is in Israel in this picture here, right? As we talked about, is very small, 20 to 25,000 people, largely on the coast in Haifa or Jaffa. All right, next slide. Okay, the causes of World War II. Why did we get this rampant anti-Semitism and rampant sort of anti-immigrant stances, these sorts of things. Uh, Great Depression is crushing economies prior to World War II, right? The US is collapsing, market instability, like there's just these wild swings in the markets before we set up like the central banking system and all these sorts of things. And when people are jobless and hungry and these sorts of things, it is very easy to scapegoat an other, right? This in-group, out-group stuff. And so, we see it in the US when times are getting hard. We see it used by our politicians, anti immigrant sort of rhetoric and this sort of thing. And there's even sort of some white nationalism rising even in America. But, these are trends that tend to happen when the middle and the lower classes start to really collapse. And they happen internationally, right? And we talked about before, too, the Arab Spring, right? The mass influx of immigration causing frustrations and the rise of far right parties and Nazism and things like this. But yeah, this collapse of the entire global economy, in addition to the humiliation dumped on the Germans through the Treaty of Versailles, which said that they had to pay reparations to the Allied Axis during World War One. What happens is the German state just starts to basically print money, right? There is an enormous gap between inflation for a state, which can be a very excellent thing. If your state is in debt, you just print money. The money obviously becomes worth less, but you meet your numerical obligation, right? The problem with that, though, is the citizen um, just paying off a bunch of debt and printing money by the state, which is good for the state, is terrible for the citizen, right? Causes hyperinflation, it causes hunger, it causes frustration, it causes all of these things. So not only did we see this um, in Germany prior to World War II, we also saw this in France prior to the French Revolution. They had given a bunch of money to the Americans and paid to help the Americans win their colonial American Revolution, but they were in crippling debt, right, in the 1780s in France, and it caused mass frustration again, right? And it ended up, it ended in the guillotine, right? Um, so this hyperinflation can cause real problems. It can cause citizens to turn toward safety and sometimes even hate and these sorts of things to protect the quote unquote native population. And so, yeah, you get the rise of the Aryan nation and socialism in Germany. Nazism, Nazi, just means national socialist, right? We're going to take care of our own people through socialism. That generally meant Aryan, white, blue eyed people, right? And this led to extremism in the era, and the scapegoat for the most part was Jewish people, right? Anti-Semitism was rising across the entire continent. Remember, hyperinflation and the Great Depression didn't just hit the U.S. and Germany; it hit everyone. And so, in many ways, Jewish people were facing oppression and scapegoating in all across Europe, right? All right, next slide. The Havara Agreement in Germany in the 1930s basically said, okay, we want Jewish people out of our country, um, but we're going to let you emigrate, right? We're going to let you leave. There were rules around sometimes you had to leave your assets and your money, these sorts of things, but you could flee the country, right? Eventually, in the late 1930s, emigration by Jewish people was blocked, and the atrocities of the Holocaust sort of were ramped up, and they were like, well, rather than letting them get away, we're just going to murder them all, right? And so, post World War II and during World War II, you get a mass exodus of Jewish people from Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia as well. And then you can see here on the map sort of where people landed, not only during the Havara Agreement era, right, where the US took in the most, but also sort of post World War II, and which European states gained Jewish population and which lost, right? And you can see there are very few places in Europe where Jewish people were willing to flee to, right? And France and Spain look to be some of the most friendly areas. All right, final slide. Okay, so in November of 1947, the UN adopts the resolution to partition Palestine, basically, right? The British mandate is ending. The UN wants to do something before the UN or before the British protectorate ends. Excuse me. And so the moment basically the British mandate ends, the Israeli state declares independence, and war just completely breaks out, right? And Jews and Arab people or Palestinians clash. The UK basically just stands aside. It says, all right, we'll help people to flee, but for the most part, we just simply don't want to get involved. Israel wasn't doing all that great until Plan Dalet, which carried out to capture and expel Arabs and Muslims from multiple cities, right? The Jewish people wanted to set up bases or strategic positions in the region, and they did this through Plan Dalet, which was pretty violent, and there was a lot of internal migration. That next year, the mandate ends, and we sort of see where things stand today, right? Once the mandate ends, Israel immediately declares independence. There's clashes. We get the Arab-Israeli War, which we talked about in the book, with a whole bunch of states, including Syria and Egypt, attacking Israel and getting whomped on. At the end of the war, Israel holds about 78% of the territory, whereas they had a very small proportion before. And we have seen basically tension since, right? Okay, I'm going to leave it there. We'll pick up Israel later in their history. We've touched on sort of some of it, right? The 1967 war, the 1973 Yom Kippur or Ramadan war, but we will be back. But I wanted to sort of give you a different perspective on the history, um, a little bit more through sort of the international lens, right? All right, thanks for being here. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll post the lecture slides and this.